Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. We're here in my room by my seed starting station because we're going to talk about starting seeds today. Not quite time to start them, at least where I am here in Connecticut, but it is definitely time to start planning and to get a schedule. And that's what we're really going to be talking about today, is coming up with a schedule for starting your seeds and basically how I do that. So I'm going to give you some basic guidelines for how I come up with my schedule today. I am in Connecticut. I'm in Zone 6. My estimated last frost date is usually around May 15th each year. So your exact dates will not necessarily be the same as mine. You may need to adjust if your last frost date is earlier or later than mine, or if you live in a warmer or cooler area. The exact dates that you use to start your seeds may be different than mine, but what we're going to talk about today is just how I come up with the dates that I start my seeds so that you can use the same principle to come up with your own seed starting schedule that works for your area. So this is not the full list of seeds that I'll be starting this year, but I just tried to pull out a selection so that you can get an idea of some of the different types of seeds I'll be starting, and we'll be talking about using these as examples here. So the first thing that you're going to want to do when you're coming up with your seed starting schedule is to find out when the last frost date is for your area. Now, I mentioned that for my area here in central Connecticut, it's approximately May 15th. Now, the exact date varies year to year. The last few years, it's actually been a little bit earlier than May 15th, and I think most years it is earlier than May 15th. But there is still a chance that we're going to get frost in my area all the way up until May 15th, so I like to plan on that to be safe. And if you start your seeds a little bit later, if you end up planting out a little bit after your last frost date, in most areas that won't really be a big deal. So what you're going to want to do is just look up, just put in an online search and find out the estimated last frost date for your city or the nearest, major city or town to you, and just see what the internet recommends that you use as your last frost date. Once you have that date, you can also fine-tune that date a little bit by talking to experienced gardeners in your area. Whether you know someone in your life or whether you go online, maybe join a local gardening Facebook group, you can get some ideas from other people that have experienced gardening in your exact growing conditions. You can find out when they start their seeds as well. And you can find out how reliable that last frost date estimate is for your area. But that's the first thing that you're going to want to know, because all of the other dates are going to be based around that. So the other information that you're really going to need to know to get started planning your schedule is to figure out which seeds need to be started early inside and which seeds need to be direct sown outside. So for example, lettuce, I'm not going to be starting early inside. Lettuce can be planted directly out in my garden because that's a lot easier. That's what I'm going to do for all seeds that works really well for. The same is true of beans. These are bush beans, but pole beans are the same. They can be started directly outside, and peas as well. So these are all plants that I am going to plant directly outside. Additionally, zucchini. And depending on your specific area, cucumbers may work for you to do that as well. Cucumbers actually prefer to be direct sown, which means you just stick the seed outside in the ground where the plant is going to spend its whole life. So that's what I prefer to do. The last couple years, though, I have had a problem with slugs eating my seedlings as soon as they come up. Because of that, I've been starting my cucumbers early inside, or at least starting some of them inside, just because the slugs don't seem to bother them once they're a little more established. So things like that will kind of be a judgment call for your area. What I'll probably do is start a couple of these inside as insurance, and I'll start some outside as well. So as I said, this is a pest issue. This is not a plant issue. These mature in plenty of time that you don't need to start these early inside in most growing conditions unless you have a pest issue like I do. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to go ahead and put the cucumbers in that pile there. Now we're going to look at these other seeds that we have here. Peppers definitely need to be started early, and so do tomatoes. Onions need to be started early. Broccoli, when you look at your seed packet, now this gives me the option to either start indoors early or to direct sow. In my experience, broccoli does a lot better being started early, so I'll be starting that early. Zinnias are a little bit of an interesting case, which we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But for the purposes of this video, I will be starting a few zinnias early inside and I will be direct sowing more outside. We'll talk a little bit more about why that is later on in this video. So we'll start with these direct sow seeds first. These are a little bit easier. These, oops, dropping bean seeds on the floor. These are the seeds that I don't need to start early inside. Those are plants that have a fairly short days to maturity. They can complete their entire life cycle up to the point where we want to harvest them in a short enough time that we don't need to start them early inside to make sure that we get a harvest. So now we're going to take a look at this pile of seeds, and we're going to further split it up into cool weather plants and warm weather plants. Now you can find out most of this information by reading your seed packet. For example, these beans here say that they can be direct sown after the last frost. It does give me an option to start them indoors 2 to 3 weeks before the last frost, but because I also have the option to direct sow, I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Some of this comes with a little bit of experience too, just knowing what plants do better in which conditions. As I said, the beans, I don't think I've ever actually started beans inside, because when they grow completely happily and completely successfully for me, being started directly outside, I'm not going to worry about starting them inside, just taking up more time, I don't have a big greenhouse. The space under my grow lights is limited, and I don't want to use up that space on plants that really don't need the space, that will be completely fine started directly outside. So some of that kind of goes with experience. I showed you on the broccoli seed packet. Let's take a look at that. This gives the option of starting early inside or direct sowing. It has been my experience that broccoli doesn't do very well in my area if you direct sow it. That may be different in other areas. In my experience, broccoli does a lot better direct sown. So that is a situation where talking to local gardeners, if your seed packet gives you multiple options, talk to local gardeners in your area and see what they have the best results with. That way you're going to have more specific directions for your area. Now back to the seed packets. Now, the seed packet will also tell you, for example, beans, if you're going to direct sow outdoors, it says after the last frost. Now, snap peas will be different. This says as soon as soil is workable, 6 to 8 weeks prior. Oh, so it's giving us a couple options here. So in the spring, it can be as soon as the soil is workable, basically as soon as the soil is defrosted and you can dig in the soil. And you can also get a second crop of peas 6 to 8 weeks before the first fall frost. So that means that these peas are a cool weather crop. They won't be killed by freezing temperatures. So we'll find that lettuce is in that same category. Lettuce also does not mind freezing temperatures. Zucchini is definitely a warm weather plant, and cucumbers are warm weather plants. So that means for these seeds here, so if we look at our zucchini packet, it says not frost hardy. We know that we need to plant this after the last frost. So every seed variety that you have, they are going to be direct sowing that is not frost hardy is going to be planted after your estimated last frost. Now you may want to wait even a week or two past that to give the soil time to warm up and just to make sure there isn't an isolated late frost. So all of these plants, those can go on your schedule at your last frost date or a week or two afterwards. So as I said, my estimated last frost date is May 15th. So that means anytime after May 15th, I can go ahead and plant these outside, and I can know that they're going to at least have a good chance of success. With the cool weather plants, now you saw with the sugar snap peas, those are one of the most cold tolerant plants you can grow. So all of this information should be on your seed packet. If you have a situation where you have seeds like this, these are seeds that I saved from my garden. They don't have a seed packet with information. If you have seeds like that, it may be seeds you saved yourself or seeds that you were given by a friend where there isn't all that information on there, just go ahead and do an internet search for that specific variety and that type of plant, and you should be able to find lots of information about that. But if you're buying seeds from a reputable seed company, they should give you lots of information on the seed packet that will help you make your seed starting schedule. So what I do, all the cool weather plants that I like to grow, that I like to direct sow, that includes peas, that includes lettuce, that includes, I'm not showing everything here. That includes lots of other greens like Asian greens, spinach, any of those plants that are really tolerant of cool temperatures. You want to wait until your soil is obviously not frozen, and you want to wait until it has warmed up enough that you can easily work the soil. That means you can dig through it without having to chop up clumps of ice. The soil stays, at a nice soil texture. So you can plant those plants fairly early. I like to plant my peas and my lettuce and all those plants as early as possible. In my area, some years that's as early as mid-March. Sometimes it's not until early April. So it's going to depend on the weather year to year. The reason why cool weather plants, you want to plant them fairly early rather than waiting till after the last frost. These plants, for example, the lettuce and the peas that I have here, are not going to do really well in the really hot summer temperatures. So I want to make sure that these have enough time to give me a harvest before it gets really hot. Most of the time when we're gardening, we think about getting a harvest before frost, before it gets really cold. And most of the time that's the case. But with cool weather plants, we want to get the harvest before it gets too hot. So now that we've planned our schedule for these plants here, oh, and by the way, we'll just admire all these beans. These are bean seeds, rattlesnake beans that I saved from last year. And I'm going to save a couple of these seeds for growing, and I think I may end up cooking some of these up. So that is not at all the point of this video. I just figured I would point it out since those are sitting here in the background. So now we have our seeds that we're going to be starting early inside. What we can do is take a look at the seed packet, and here we see 6 to 8 weeks before last frost for tomatoes. So if I take my tomatoes, which say to start about 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost date, and then I count backwards 8 weeks from my last frost date, which as I mentioned is May 15th, we're going to end up with about April 20th. Now, it doesn't need to be exactly on that day. What I usually try to do is start my seeds within a week or so of that day, but that just gives me a guideline, and that way I know I can put on my calendar, start my tomato seeds around April 20th. So that will give these plants time to grow big enough to transplant, time for me to get them gradually used to being outside, and time to get them in the garden, within a short period of my last frost date so that I get the maximum harvest time possible for my tomatoes. So we're just going to go through our other seed packets here and just basically apply that same principle. So I have shishito peppers here, and these say to start, 8 to 12 weeks before the last frost date. So I'm going to count back on my calendar the same way I did for the tomatoes. So I think I might have misspoken and said April 20th. I actually meant March 20th. So if I said April 20th before, please disregard that and replace it with March 20th. That's when I would be planning to start my tomatoes. And if I went with the 8-week date for the peppers as well, then that would be the same, March 20th. In reality, I do usually start my pepper plants a couple weeks before my tomato plants. So what I will probably do, I may end up starting my tomato plants a week later than what I said because we counted back 8 weeks. The seed packet said start 6 to 8 weeks. So I'll probably actually plant on 7 weeks, which will be March 27th. And these will probably get started about 2 weeks before that. So I can go ahead and look up that date on my calendar, write that down, and then I know I want to start all my peppers that day. So I'm just going to go through all the different plants that I want to start inside and do the same thing. Onions say 8 to 10 weeks before last frost. I'm going to start those probably a little bit earlier, in fact, because I think they do better if they have a little bit longer. Broccoli, I'm going to actually start a little bit earlier than it says as well. One thing that you'll find is that as you gain a little bit more experience gardening, you will be able to fine-tune these recommendations a little bit. Now, if it's your first time gardening or your first time starting seeds and you don't really know where to start, then the dates on the seed packet will give you a great starting point. But as you gain a little more experience, you can kind of play with it a little bit and see what works better for you. So in my experience, this seed packet is assuming that I'm going to be planting out my broccoli after my last frost date. In reality, I find that broccoli in my area does better if I plant it out about 4 weeks before my last frost date. So I would be planting that out mid-April instead of mid-May. So when it says start indoors, 4 to 6 weeks before last frost, I'm actually going to start at 4 to 6 weeks before I'll be planting it out. That being said, as I said, please don't let this be overwhelming because the fine-tuning the dates kind of comes with a little bit of experience. As I said before, you can also talk to gardeners in your area, find out when they start their broccoli seeds. So if it's your first time starting seeds and you're not sure what to do, just go with what the seed packet says. Follow the directions on the seed packet. That's a great place to start. And if it doesn't seem to work quite right, you can gradually improve it by fine-tuning it, kind of changing it a little bit year by year as time goes on. So let's take a look at the seed starting schedule that I've come up with for this year. So the first seeds on my schedule to start on February 13th would be onions. Now this is a guideline. I may not start my onions exactly that day, but that's going to give me a guideline of about when I want to start them. Next, on March 4th, I plan to start broccoli and other plants in the same family. That includes broccoli, of course, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, plants like that. So that's about 6 weeks before, well, it's basically 10 weeks before my last frost date. I plan to plant those plants out in the garden about 4 weeks before my last frost date and start them 6 weeks before that. Next, on March 13th, I plan to start peppers. Then in mid-March to early April, depending on weather conditions, I have my direct sow plants, the cool tolerant ones. So that will include peas, that'll include lettuce, greens. You could also plant radishes at that time, plants like that. Then the next date that I have scheduled is March 27th to start my tomatoes inside. Then sometime between April 10th to 17th, I plan to start some flowers inside. Those will be quick maturing flowers, annual flowers for the vegetable garden. That'll include things like zinnias, that'll include cosmos, that'll include nasturtiums. And then after the last frost day, I will direct sow more of those outside. But I plan to start a few of them, as I said, early inside, between April 10th to 17th. And then finally, the last frost date comes, approximately May 15th, and after that, then I'm clear to direct sow whatever I want outside. So that's going to include all my warm weather plants that I want to direct sow. That's going to include more of the flowers that I mentioned. It will include zucchinis, it'll include cucumbers, it'll include beans. And I think I forgot to mention, on the April 10th to 17th date, I mentioned flowers. I'm also going to start some basil early on that date as well. So that is my tentative schedule for this coming seed starting season. I'm sure I will probably add a few more things onto that schedule, but as of right now, that's what I've come up with. So I hope that that gives you a little bit of guidance when you're coming up with your own seed starting schedule. I did mention about the zinnias. Basically, I plan to direct sow some of those in the garden because it's so much easier. I also plan to start a couple of them early inside just to get a little bit of a head start on the blooms. It's going to extend my flower season, and who doesn't want a long season of beautiful flowers? So please don't let anything in this video become overwhelming. Please don't let the idea of starting seeds become overwhelming, because anything that is new can seem overwhelming just because it's new and it's unfamiliar. Once you get started with it and you have a little more practice, it does become so much easier. So I encourage you to give it a try and not be overwhelmed. If you have any questions about seed starting, please definitely follow along with me as the season goes on, because we're going to be doing some seed starting together really soon. If you have any specific questions, please also go ahead and leave them in the comments. I will do my best to answer you as best I can. And hopefully if we have some other experienced gardeners watching, I hope you guys will chime in and help answer questions as well. So I hope that you're having a great day. I hope that you're looking forward to seed starting and this gardening season, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.